Hi, this is Knitting Step by Step, the video podcast that's been teaching you how to knit. I'm your host, Jason Block.
And I'm your knitting instructor, Ivy Reisner.
And this is episode 3, the very hot, the very sticky, and the very humid episode known as Gauge. Now, by this time, you should have already started your garter stitch scarf and be very comfortable about knitting across each row back and forth, because last week we taught you the knit stitch. Now, this week, we're going to teach you 3 things. 1, gauge, what it means and how you measure it. 2, the very important skill of picking up stitches, because even the best knitters lose stitches and have to get them back. So we're going to learn how to do that. And number 3, another important skill, which is joining yarn, because as far as I know, there isn't a magical bowl of yarn that continues to go on and on and on. I mean, that only happens in Harry Potter novels and things like that.
Where'd you find one? Let me know.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. But at first, we're going to learn what gauge is. So, for everyone out there, what is gauge and how do you define it?
Gauge can refer both to row gauge and to stitch gauge. Normally it refers to stitch gauge, and that's how many stitches you have in an inch. Row gauge refers to how many rows you have in an inch. Gauge is important because it defines the size of your garment.
Okay, so in a second, we're going to show you how you measure gauge and how you count rows in the product that you've knit. Okay, we're going to learn how you measure gauge. Ivy, measure the gauge on this particular knit scarf that we've been working on.
Okay, first you lay a ruler against your knitting, and then you're going to count these bumps right here. So, you're going to count them for 4 inches. Let's go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. So I have 20 stitches in 4 inches, which means I've got a gauge of 5 stitches to the inch. Now, if you're not getting a gauge of 5 stitches to the inch for this project, don't worry. Your scarf may turn out a little narrower or a little wider, but it's a scarf. It's going to fit.
Okay, so now let's count the rows in this scarf.
Okay? You want to turn your ruler so that it's pointing along the rows, and you're going to count these bump rows as 1 row and these valleys as another. And again, we're going to count for 4 inches. So let's go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38. 38 rows in 4 inches is about 9.5 rows to the inch.
Okay, we've just learned how to count rows and measure gauge. What does that measurement mean for the knitter for any project that you use?
Okay, that's what's going to tell you what the ultimate width of your garment is going to be. If you get a gauge of 5 stitches to the inch and you cast on 50 stitches, you know you're going to get a piece that's 10 inches wide. Now, it's important to measure your gauge and make sure that you're getting the same gauge as the designer, because even if you're only off by a half a stitch, that could mean as much as a 4 to 6 inch difference in the final width of, say, a sweater. Now, gauge will also empower you to not use the yarn that the designer intended. If the pattern calls for getting a gauge of 4 stitches to the inch and asks you to cast on 80 stitches, you know that the piece that you're about to knit will be 20 inches wide. If the yarn you want to use gives you a gauge of 6 stitches to the inch. You still know you need that thing to become 20 inches wide, so you cast on 120 stitches instead. Now, a lot of times knitters will get stitch gauge but not get row gauge, and in that case it's usually easier to try to get stitch gauge and adjust for row gauge. If you're only knitting to a specified length, then you can just ignore row gauge altogether. If you're knitting something like a sleeve, which tapers every certain number of inches, you just compute how many inches you need to get, how many rows you need to get to that particular inch mark, and then make your decreases or increases at that point.
However, shouldn't the designer actually have told any pattern, any person who's knitting, what needles they should get and what yarn they should have?
And it would seem so, yes. But even if you use the exact same yarn and the exact same needles, how tight you hold your yarn will affect your gauge. If you're getting more stitches to the inch than the pattern calls for, they're kind of crammed in there, you need to use a bigger needle to loosen up. If you're getting too few stitches to the inch, they're taking too much space, you need to use a smaller needle to tighten your gauge. You do want to aim for getting the same gauge as the designer, or you have to make adjustments.
Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to show you how you pick up a drop. Okay, you've made a mistake. You've dropped a stitch. Don't panic. I'm just going to show you how to fix it. And there's 2 ways that she's going to show. First, this one is called the knitting needle method. Ivy, save people's knitting this way.
Okay, so you have a drop stitch, and this is your drop stitch, and you can see it has this ladder above it, and I'm going to try to make it as easy to see as possible. These 2 rungs of yarn, this 2-rung ladder. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to try to figure out which way you need to pick the stitch up, knitwise or purlwise. And to understand a garter stitch a little bit, because you're working back and forth, first you're getting a row that's the front side of the knit stitch, and then you're getting a row that's the back side of the knit stitch. The back side of the knit stitch is, again, the purl stitch. So, let's take a look at this stitch here, shall we? Get it nice and onto the needle to see it. And you can see this little bump here. That little bump tells me that this is the back of a knit stitch. It's a purl stitch. So the next row has to be the front of a knit stitch, and that's the way I have to pick up. So I'm going to go and I'm going to pick up the bottom rung of this little ladder, and I'm going to hold it in front of the stitch on this needle. I'm then going to take my left hand needle, I'm going to go into the stitch, I'm going to take it over that ladder rung part and drop it off the side. Now you can see I have this little V here, and that bar is to the back. That's a knit stitch. The next one I have to pick up purlwise, which means this bump is going to come into the front. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do things a little bit differently. I'm going to first transfer the stitch to my left-handed needle, and then I'm going to pick up this last bar here, okay, and I'm going to put it in front of it on the left-handed needle. So you see I've got the bar, this is the bar I'm playing with right now, and this is the stitch, okay, the bar and the stitch. I'm now going to transfer both back to my right-handed needle. And again, you've got the stitch, and you've got the bar. I'm going to lift the stitch up over the bar so that it drops forward. And now you can see I've got that bump, I've got that purl bump going. I have picked up my stitch, and I can continue to knit.